The signing of the Magna Carta marks a pivotal moment in human history, forever altering the balance of power between rulers and the ruled. This seminal event's influence can still be felt today, shaping modern democracy and individual rights. The fate of freedom hangs in the balance as we embark on a journey to uncover the epic story behind this foundational document. In the early 13th century, England was a land of stark contrasts, where the majesty of medieval castles stood alongside the humblest of villages, and the power of the monarch seemed almost absolute. It was an era of grandeur and upheaval, as the Norman conquest of 1066 had left an indelible mark on the nation's language, culture, and politics. The ruling class, largely of Norman descent, held sway over the Anglo-Saxon population, who still clung to their ancient traditions and customs. King John, also known as Bad King John, sat upon the throne, his reputation for ruthlessness and cunning already well established. The youngest son of Henry II, John had ascended to power in 1199 following the death of his brother Richard the Lionheart. His reign would prove to be a tumultuous one, marked by conflict with the church, struggles with his barons, and a series of disastrous military campaigns. As we delve into the world of 13th century England, it is essential to understand the complex web of relationships between the monarch, the nobility, and the emerging middle class. The feudal system, with its intricate network of obligations and dependencies, formed the backbone of medieval society. Lords granted land to their vassals in exchange for military service, while peasants toiled on the land, bound to the soil by ties of duty and tradition. The city of London, a thriving commercial center, played a significant role in the events that would unfold. Its merchants and traders had grown wealthy and influential, and they began to chafe against the restrictions imposed upon them by the monarch. The Cinque Ports, a confederation of 5 strategic ports on the southeastern coast, also held considerable power, as their ships controlled the vital trade routes across the English Channel. In this volatile landscape, tensions simmered between the king and his barons. John's arbitrary and often cruel behavior had alienated many of his nobles, who felt that their rights and privileges were being systematically eroded. The barons, led by men such as Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, and Henry de Bohun, Earl of Hereford, began to organize a resistance against the monarch's abuses of power. As the discontent among the barons grew, they turned to the ancient customs and laws of England, seeking to reassert their traditional rights and liberties. The idea of a charter, a formal document outlining the relationship between the king and his subjects, began to take shape. This concept was not new. Similar charters had been issued by earlier monarchs, such as Henry I's coronation charter of 1100. However, the barons' vision for this new document was more ambitious, seeking to establish clear limits on the king's authority and protect the rights of all freemen. As the barons' vision for a charter took shape, they drew inspiration from earlier documents, such as the Coronation Charter of 1100, which had established certain rights and limitations on the monarch's power. However, their ambition was to create something more comprehensive, a document that would not only reaffirm traditional liberties, but also introduce new protections for the rights of all freemen. To achieve this, they turned to the expertise of Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, who played a pivotal role in drafting the charter. Langton, a respected scholar and theologian, brought his knowledge of canon law and ecclesiastical traditions to the task. He was well versed in the writings of the Church Fathers and the principles of natural law, which emphasized the inherent dignity and worth of all human beings. As he worked on the draft, Langton drew upon these intellectual currents, infusing the document with a sense of moral purpose and spiritual authority. The drafting process was a collaborative effort, involving not only Langton, but also other prominent barons, such as Henry de Bohun, Earl of Hereford, and Roger Bigod, Earl of Norfolk. These men brought their own experiences and perspectives to the table, shaping the document's language and content. They debated and negotiated, refining their ideas and hammering out a consensus on the key issues. One of the most significant challenges they faced was defining the relationship between the monarch and his subjects. The barons sought to establish clear limits on the king's authority, while also acknowledging his role as the supreme ruler of the land. This delicate balance was reflected in the document's preamble, which acknowledged John's sovereignty, while also asserting the rights and liberties of the nobles and freemen. As the draft took shape, it became clear that the charter would be a sweeping document, addressing a wide range of issues from feudal obligations and taxation to justice and the administration of law. The barons included provisions to protect the rights of widows, orphans, and other vulnerable groups, as well as clauses governing the conduct of royal officials and the use of arbitrary power. The document's famous clause, 39, which stated that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, nor will we go against him except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land, was a landmark statement of principle enshrining the concept of due process and equal justice under the law. With the draft nearing completion, the barons began to make plans for its presentation to King John. They knew that the monarch would be reluctant to accept such a sweeping limitation on his authority, and so they prepared for a confrontation. In June 1215, the barons gathered at Northampton, where they intended to present their charter to the king. However, John failed to appear, citing reasons of health and security. Undeterred, the barons decided to take a bold step, marching on London and occupying the city in a show of force. This audacious move caught the king off guard, and he was forced to negotiate with the barons, eventually agreeing to meet them at Runnymede, a meadow near Windsor Castle. As the barons marched on London and occupied the city, King John was forced to reevaluate his position. He realized that the nobles were determined to see their charter implemented, and that resistance would only lead to further conflict. With his back against the wall, John agreed to meet the barons at Runnymede, a neutral location near Windsor Castle. The choice of venue was significant, as it was a place where the king had often held court and hunted, but also a spot where the nobles felt they could negotiate on equal terms. On June 15, 1215, the two sides gathered at Runnymede amidst the tranquil surroundings of the Thames River Valley. The barons, led by Stephen Langton, Henry de Bohun, and Roger Bigod, presented their charter to the king, who was accompanied by his advisors and a small retinue of loyalists. The atmosphere was tense, with both sides aware that the fate of English liberty hung in the balance. John, still hoping to find ways to undermine the document, requested time to consider the proposals, but the barons were insistent that he provide a definitive answer. After several days of intense negotiation, during which the king attempted to water down certain clauses and introduce loopholes, the barons remained resolute. They were determined to ensure that the charter would be a meaningful limitation on the monarch's power, rather than simply a symbolic gesture. On June 19, 1215, King John finally agreed to accept the document, appending his seal to the parchment in a symbolic act of acceptance. The Magna Carta, as it would come to be known, consisted of 63 clauses, each addressing a specific aspect of feudal relationships, justice, and governance. The signing of the charter was a momentous occasion, marked by a sense of relief and trepidation. The barons had achieved their goal, but they knew that the king's acceptance was only the first step in a long process of implementation and enforcement. As the nobles departed Runnymede, they were aware that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, as they sought to ensure that the provisions of the charter were respected and upheld. Meanwhile, King John, still seething with resentment, began to plot his revenge, seeking ways to undermine the document and reassert his authority. In the aftermath of the signing, the barons took steps to publicize the charter, disseminating copies throughout the kingdom and ensuring that its provisions were widely known. This was a crucial aspect of their strategy, as they sought to build support among the broader population and create a sense of ownership and investment in the document. The charter's famous clause 61, which established a council of 25 barons to oversee its implementation and enforce its provisions, was a key component of this effort, providing a mechanism for ongoing monitoring and accountability. As news of the Magna Carta spread, it sparked a mixture of reactions across the kingdom. Some saw it as a bold assertion of liberty and a check on arbitrary power, while others viewed it as a threat to the established order and the king's authority. The bishops, who had played a significant role in the drafting process, were generally supportive, recognizing the document's potential to promote justice and protect the rights of the church. However, Not all ecclesiastical leaders were enthusiastic, with some expressing concerns about the charter's implications for the monarch's relationship with the papacy. As the news of the Magna Carta spread, it reached the ears of Pope Innocent III, who was less than pleased with the development. The Pope saw the charter as an attempt to limit the monarch's authority and undermine the power of the Church. He wrote a scathing letter to King John, denouncing the Magna Carta as unlawful and detestable and declaring it null and void of all validity forever. The Pope's disapproval was not surprising, given the charter's provisions that limited the monarch's ability to raise taxes and wage war without consulting his barons. Meanwhile, King John began to secretly gather support among his loyalist nobles and mercenaries, seeking to reassert his authority and undermine the Magna Carta. He wrote to the Pope, asking for his assistance in overturning the charter and punishing the rebellious barons. The king's actions were cautious at first, as he sought to avoid provoking the barons into open rebellion. However, his intentions were clear. He would stop at nothing to restore his absolute power and destroy the Magna Carta. In response to the king's machinations, the barons who had signed the Magna Carta began to take steps to protect themselves and their properties. They formed alliances with other nobles and fortified their castles, preparing for the possibility of war. Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, played a key role in mediating between the two sides, urging the king to uphold the charter and warning the barons against taking any actions that might be seen as provocative. As tensions escalated, the kingdom teetered on the brink of civil war. The barons, led by men like Henry de Bohun and Roger Bigod, were determined to defend their rights and liberties, while the king was equally resolute in his desire to crush the rebellion and restore his authority. In the summer of 1215, King John began to make his move, assembling an army of mercenaries and loyalist nobles at Northampton. The barons, anticipating this development, had already begun to mobilize their own forces, with many gathering at Stamford in Lincolnshire. The two armies were now on a collision course, and it seemed increasingly likely that the dispute over the Magna Carta would be settled by force of arms. As the rival armies prepared for battle, the country held its breath. The fate of the Magna Carta, and with it the future of English liberty, hung in the balance. The barons, despite being outnumbered, were determined to fight for their rights, while the king was equally resolved to destroy the rebellion and restore his absolute power. The outcome was far from certain, but one thing was clear: the consequences of defeat would be catastrophic for the losing side. The first skirmishes between the two armies took place in the autumn of 1215, with the barons launching a series of raids against the king's loyalist strongholds. These early clashes were inconclusive, but they set the tone for the conflict that was to come. The war over the Magna Carta had begun, and it would be fought with great ferocity and determination on both sides. As the conflict escalated, the barons began to look for external support, seeking alliances with other European powers that might help them tip the balance in their favor. They found a willing ally in Prince Louis of France, who saw an opportunity to weaken his rival, King John, and gain a foothold in England. The prince's involvement would add a new dimension to the conflict, drawing in external powers and raising the stakes for all parties involved. The entry of Prince Louis into the conflict marked a significant turning point in the war over the Magna Carta. The barons, bolstered by French support, began to gain the upper hand, capturing key strongholds and pushing the king's forces back. King John, realizing that his position was becoming increasingly untenable, was forced to retreat to the south of England, where he hoped to regroup and launch a counterattack. As King John retreated to the south of England, he became increasingly isolated and desperate. His attempts to rally support among his loyalist nobles were met with skepticism, and many began to question his ability to lead the country. Meanwhile, Prince Louis of France continued to provide significant military and financial backing to the barons, who were now making gains in key regions such as Kent and Sussex. In May 1216, Prince Louis landed at Sandwich in Kent, bringing with him a large army of French soldiers. The barons, emboldened by this new support, launched a series of bold attacks against King John's strongholds, capturing important castles such as Rochester and Winchester. The king, realizing that his position was becoming increasingly untenable, was forced to flee to the west of England, where he hoped to find safety among his loyalist supporters in the Welsh marches. As the conflict escalated, the city of London became a key prize for both sides. In June 1216, Prince Louis entered the city, where he was greeted as a hero by the inhabitants. The barons, who had long been dissatisfied with King John's rule, saw Prince Louis as a potential savior, and many pledged their allegiance to him. The city's strategic location, controlling access to the Thames River and the English Channel, made it a crucial stronghold for whoever controlled it. King John, realizing that he could not retake London by force, attempted to negotiate with Prince Louis and the barons. He offered significant concessions, including the recognition of the Magna Carta as a binding document and the establishment of a council of 25 barons to oversee his actions. However, these efforts were met with skepticism, and the barons demanded more concrete guarantees of their rights and liberties. As the summer of 1216 wore on, the conflict showed no signs of abating. Prince Louis continued to make gains in southern England, capturing key castles and towns, while King John struggled to maintain control over his dwindling territories. The war over the Magna Carta had become a full-blown rebellion, with both sides committed to fighting for their vision of England's future. In August 1216, King John suffered a significant setback when he lost control of the city of Dover, which was captured by Prince Louis's forces after a long siege. This strategic port city controlled access to the English Channel, and its loss dealt a severe blow to King John's ability to receive support from his continental allies. As the autumn of 1216 approached, King John's position became increasingly desperate. He was isolated, outnumbered, and outgunned, with Prince Louis and the barons closing in on him from all sides. The Magna Carta, once a symbol of hope for English liberties, had become a rallying cry for rebellion against a king who seemed determined to destroy it. The fate of England hung in the balance, as the conflict over the Magna Carta entered its most critical phase yet. In October 1216, King John's health began to decline, and he became increasingly incapacitated. His son, Henry, was still a minor, and the question of who would succeed him as king remained uncertain. The barons, sensing victory within their grasp, pressed their advantage, launching a series of bold attacks against King John's remaining strongholds. As King John's health continued to decline, he became increasingly unable to lead his forces effectively, and his son Henry's Regency Council began to take on more responsibility for the conduct of the war. The council, led by William Marshal, a seasoned military leader and one of the most powerful nobles in England, worked to rally support among the remaining loyalist nobles and to negotiate with the rebel barons. Meanwhile, Prince Louis, sensing victory within his grasp, continued to press his advantage, launching a series of bold attacks against King John's remaining strongholds. In November 1216, King John's condition took a turn for the worse, and he was forced to flee to the island of Newark, where he hoped to find safety and recover from his illness. However, his health continued to decline, and on October 19, 1216, he died, leaving behind a power vacuum and a deeply divided kingdom. The news of King John's death sent shockwaves throughout England, and both the loyalist and rebel factions began to maneuver for position in the impending succession crisis. The Regency Council, led by William Marshal, quickly moved to secure the throne for King John's son Henry, who was just 9 years old at the time. The council issued a proclamation declaring Henry the rightful King of England and began to make arrangements for his coronation. However, Prince Louis and the rebel barons were not willing to recognize Henry as king, and they continued to press their claim to the throne. In an effort to bolster their position, the Regency Council decided to reissue the Magna Carta, which had been a major point of contention between King John and the rebel barons. The new version of the charter, known as the Charter of 1216, was issued in Henry's name and included several key concessions, including the establishment of a council of 25 barons to oversee the king's actions and the protection of the rights and liberties of all freemen in England. The reissue of the Magna Carta was a significant turning point in the conflict, as it helped to shift the balance of opinion among the nobles and the common people in favor of the loyalist faction. Many of the rebel barons, who had been motivated by a desire to protect their rights and liberties, began to see the loyalist faction as the more legitimate and trustworthy option. Prince Louis, however, remained committed to his claim to the throne, and he continued to receive support from a significant number of nobles and knights. As the conflict entered its next phase, the focus shifted from the question of who would succeed King John to the issue of how the new king's powers would be limited and balanced by the nobles and the common people. The Magna Carta, which had been a symbol of resistance against King John's tyranny, was now becoming a cornerstone of English law and politics, shaping the relationship between the monarch and his subjects for generations to come. The city of Lincoln, which had been a key stronghold for the Loyalist faction, became a focal point for the conflict in early 1217. The city was besieged by Prince Louis's forces, who hoped to capture it and use it as a base for further operations against the Loyalists. However, the defenders of the city, led by William Marshall, were well entrenched and determined to hold out against the rebel forces. The siege of Lincoln was a brutal and intense affair, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The city's walls were breached, and the defenders were forced to retreat to the castle, where they continued to resist the rebel forces. Prince Louis's army was ultimately repelled, but not before they had inflicted significant damage on the city and its inhabitants. The failure of the siege marked a significant turning point in the conflict, as it demonstrated that the Loyalist faction was capable of resisting the rebel forces and defending their strongholds. The Regency Council, emboldened by this success, began to take a more aggressive stance against the rebels, launching a series of counterattacks against Prince Louis's forces. As the spring of 1217 wore on, the conflict continued to escalate, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The war was becoming increasingly brutal and destructive, with entire towns and villages being burned to the ground, and their inhabitants forced to flee or face starvation. The English nobles, who had once been united in their opposition to King John's tyranny, were now divided against each other, with some fighting for the Loyalist faction and others supporting Prince Louis's claim to the throne. As the spring of 1217 wore on, the conflict between the Loyalist faction and Prince Louis's forces continued to intensify. In April 1217, William Marshall, the regent for King Henry III, led a decisive victory against the rebels at the Battle of Lincoln. The battle was a turning point in the war, as it resulted in the capture of many high-ranking nobles who had supported Prince Louis, including the Earl of Winchester and the Count of Perche. The city's streets were filled with the sounds of clashing steel and the scent of smoke and blood. Despite being outnumbered, the Loyalist forces emerged victorious, thanks in large part to the tactical genius of William Marshall. The rebels, on the other hand, were left reeling from their defeat, and Prince Louis was forced to regroup and reassess his strategy. In the aftermath of the Battle of Lincoln, William Marshall and the Regency Council took steps to consolidate their power and secure the loyalty of the nobles who had supported Prince Louis. Many of these nobles were pardoned for their rebellion and allowed to swear fealty to King Henry III in exchange for their loyalty and support. This move helped to weaken Prince Louis's claim to the throne and further divided his supporters. Meanwhile, Prince Louis himself was facing increasing pressure from his own allies and supporters. The French king, Philip II, had grown tired of Louis's lack of progress in England and was beginning to question whether his son was truly capable of securing the English throne. This led to a rift between Louis and his father, with Louis insisting that he needed more time and resources to achieve victory. As the summer of 1217 wore on, Prince Louis launched a series of raids against Loyalist strongholds in eastern England, hoping to weaken the Regency Council's grip on power. However, these raids were largely unsuccessful, and the Loyalist forces were able to repel the rebels with ease. The failure of these raids further eroded Prince Louis's support among his own nobles, and he was forced to consider alternative strategies for achieving his goals. In August 1217, Prince Louis turned his attention to the city of Dover, which was a key stronghold for the Loyalist faction. He laid siege to the city, hoping to capture it and use it as a base for further operations against the Regency Council. However, the defenders of Dover, led by Hubert de Burgh, were well prepared and determined to resist the rebel forces. The siege of Dover would become one of the most brutal and intense battles of the war, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The siege of Dover was marked by a series of brutal skirmishes and raids, as both sides sought to gain the upper hand. The city's walls were breached on several occasions, but the defenders were able to repel the rebels each time. Prince Louis himself was wounded in the fighting, and his forces began to lose morale. Despite this, he refused to give up, and the siege continued for several weeks. As the siege of Dover dragged on, Prince Louis's forces began to lose momentum, and the defenders, led by Hubert de Burgh, gained the upper hand. In September 1217, a fleet of English ships, commanded by Hubert de Burgh and Philip d'Aubigné, sailed from the port of Sandwich and intercepted a French fleet that was attempting to reinforce Prince Louis's army at Dover. The English ships successfully repelled the French, sinking or capturing several vessels and killing or taking prisoner many of the sailors and soldiers on board. This naval victory gave the Regency Council a significant advantage, as it prevented Prince Louis from receiving the reinforcements he needed to continue the siege of Dover. With his forces weakened and demoralized, Prince Louis was forced to lift the siege and retreat from the city. The defenders of Dover, who had held out against overwhelming odds for weeks, were hailed as heroes, and their bravery and determination were celebrated throughout England. As Prince Louis's army retreated from Dover, they left behind many of their heavy siege engines and equipment, which were captured by the English and used to strengthen the defenses of other loyalist strongholds. The Regency Council, emboldened by their victory at Dover, began to launch a series of counterattacks against Prince Louis's forces, aiming to drive them out of England once and for all. One of the key targets of these counterattacks was the city of Winchester, which had been captured by Prince Louis's forces earlier in the war. In September 1217, a loyalist army, led by William Marshal and the Earl of Chester, marched on Winchester and laid siege to the city. After a brief but intense battle, the city fell to the Loyalists, and many of Prince Louis's supporters were taken prisoner or forced to flee. The capture of Winchester was a significant blow to Prince Louis's cause, as it deprived him of a key stronghold in southern England and gave the Regency Council control of a vital city and its surrounding countryside. As the Loyalist army continued to gain momentum, Prince Louis found himself increasingly isolated and outnumbered, with fewer and fewer options available to him. In an attempt to turn the tide of the war, Prince Louis turned to his father, King Philip II of France, for help. He sent a series of urgent messages to Paris, pleading with his father to send more troops and supplies to England, and promising that with sufficient support he could still secure the English throne. However, King Philip II was growing increasingly skeptical of his son's abilities, and he was reluctant to commit more resources to a war that seemed to be going badly wrong. King Philip II of France, despite his reservations about his son's campaign, ultimately decided to send a small fleet of ships to England, hoping to bolster Prince Louis's dwindling forces. The French king, however, was cautious not to overcommit himself, and the reinforcements he sent were limited in number and scope. In October 1217, the French fleet sailed from the port of Calais, bound for the English coast, but they were intercepted by a fleet of English ships commanded by Hubert de Burgh and Philip d'Aubigné, who had earlier defeated the French at sea. The two fleets clashed off the coast of Sandwich in a battle known as the Battle of Sandwich. The English ships, manned by experienced sailors and soldiers, proved to be more than a match for the French fleet. The French ships were either sunk or captured, and many of Prince Louis's supporters were killed or taken prisoner. This naval victory was a significant blow to Prince Louis's cause, as it prevented him from receiving the reinforcements he desperately needed to continue his campaign. As the news of the Battle of Sandwich spread, Prince Louis's supporters in England began to lose heart. Many of them, realizing that their cause was doomed, started to defect to the side of King Henry III and the Regency Council. The Earl of Winchester, one of Prince Louis's key allies, was among those who switched sides, and he brought with him a significant contingent of soldiers and resources. With his forces dwindling and his supporters deserting him, Prince Louis found himself increasingly isolated in England. He retreated to the city of London, which remained one of his last strongholds, but even there, he faced opposition from the city's inhabitants, who were growing tired of the war and its devastating effects on their trade and commerce. In an attempt to shore up his support, Prince Louis issued a series of charters and grants to his remaining supporters, hoping to bind them to his cause through promises of land and privilege. However, these efforts were ultimately unsuccessful, as many of his supporters had already lost faith in his ability to win the war. As the winter of 1217 to 1218 approached, Prince Louis's position became increasingly desperate. He was running out of money, men, and supplies, and he knew that he could not hold out for much longer. In a last-ditch effort to turn the tide of the war, he turned to the Pope, Innocent III, who had earlier supported his claim to the English throne. Prince Louis appealed to the Pope to intervene on his behalf, hoping that papal intervention might persuade King Henry III and the Regency Council to come to terms. However, the Pope's response was not what Prince Louis had hoped for. Instead of supporting his claim, Innocent III issued a bull known as the Golden Bull, which condemned Prince Louis's actions in England and urged him to withdraw his forces and negotiate a peaceful settlement. The Golden Bull was a significant blow to Prince Louis's cause, as it deprived him of papal support and left him isolated and alone in his struggle for the English throne. As the news of the Golden Bull spread, Prince Louis's supporters in England began to melt away, and he was left with few options but to negotiate a surrender. In January 1218, he opened talks with the Regency Council, led by William Marshal, who had taken over as the leader of the council after the death of King John. The negotiations were difficult and protracted, but eventually Prince Louis agreed to withdraw his forces from England and renounce his claim to the throne in exchange for a generous settlement and a promise of safe conduct out of the country. As Prince Louis withdrew his forces from England, he sailed back to France, leaving behind a country that was forever changed by the events of the past year. The Regency Council, led by William Marshal, continued to govern England in the name of King Henry III, who was still only a child. One of the first tasks facing the council was to deal with the aftermath of the war and to restore order to a country that had been ravaged by conflict. In the summer of 1218, the council issued a series of instructions to the sheriffs of England, ordering them to restore the rights and properties of those who had been displaced or harmed during the war. This included the restoration of lands and castles to their rightful owners, as well as the payment of compensation to those who had suffered losses. The council also took steps to rebuild and repair the damage that had been done to churches, monasteries, and other buildings during the conflict. Meanwhile, King Henry III began to take a more active role in the governance of England. In 1218, he was crowned king for a second time, this time with greater ceremony and pomp than before. The coronation was attended by many of the leading nobles and clergy of England, and it marked an important milestone in the young king's reign. As Henry III grew older and more confident, he began to assert his authority over the Regency Council. In 1221, he appointed a new justiciar, Stephen de Lucy, who was tasked with overseeing the administration of justice in England. De Lucy proved to be an effective and fair-minded official, and he played an important role in helping to establish a more stable and efficient system of government in England. The years that followed were marked by a period of relative peace and stability in England. The country began to recover from the devastating effects of the war, and trade and commerce began to flourish once again. The nobles and clergy of England also began to rebuild and restore their properties, and many new castles, churches, and monasteries were constructed during this time. In 1225, King Henry III issued a new version of the Magna Carta, which was designed to clarify and strengthen the provisions of the original document. This new version, known as the Magna Carta of 1225, included several important changes and additions, including the establishment of a new system for the election of sheriffs and the creation of a new council to oversee the administration of justice. The Magna Carta of 1225 was an important milestone in the development of English law and government. It marked a significant shift towards a more constitutional form of monarchy, in which the power of the king was limited by the rights and privileges of his subjects. The document also established many of the principles that would shape English politics and society for centuries to come, including the protection of individual liberties, the rule of law, and the importance of representative government. As the 1220s drew to a close, England was a very different country from the one that had existed just a decade before. The war with France was over, and the country was at peace. The nobles and clergy were rebuilding and restoring their properties, and trade and commerce were flourishing once again. King Henry III was growing into a confident and effective ruler, and the Regency Council was slowly giving way to a more permanent system of government. The legacy of the Magna Carta continued to shape English politics and society, as the document remained a powerful symbol of the rights and privileges of the king's subjects. The struggle for power and authority that had marked the early years of Henry III's reign was giving way to a new era of stability and cooperation, in which the monarch, nobles, and clergy worked together to govern the country and promote the common good. In 1236, King Henry III issued a new charter known as the Charter of the Forest, which was designed to protect the rights of the common people and to limit the power of the nobles and clergy. This charter marked an important milestone in the development of English law and government, as it established many of the principles that would shape the relationship between the monarch and his subjects for centuries to come. The Charter of the Forest was a significant extension of the Magna Carta, as it protected the rights of all freemen, not just the nobles and clergy. It also established new rules and regulations for the use of forests and other common lands, and it provided for the protection of wildlife and the environment. As the 13th century drew to a close, England was a country that was characterized by a strong sense of community and a deep commitment to the principles of justice and equality. The Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest had established a framework for government and politics that would shape English society for centuries to come, and the country was poised on the brink of a new era of growth, prosperity, and development. The reign of King Henry III came to an end in 1272, when he died after a long illness. He was succeeded by his son, Edward I, who went on to become one of the most famous and influential kings in English history. Edward I was a strong and effective ruler who played a major role in shaping the course of English politics and society. During his reign, Edward I issued a series of new laws and charters, including the Statute of Mortmain and the Statute of Westminster. These documents marked an important milestone in the development of English law and government, as they established many of the principles that would shape the relationship between the monarch and his subjects for centuries to come. The Statute of Mortmain, which was issued in 1279, prohibited the nobles and clergy from granting land to the church without the king's permission. This marked an important shift towards a more secular form of government, in which the power of the monarch was limited by the rights and privileges of his subjects. The Statute of Westminster, which was issued in 1285, established a new system for the administration of justice in England. It created a new court, known as the Court of Common Pleas, which was tasked with hearing cases involving disputes over land and property. The Magna Carta, the Charter of the Forest, and the Statute of Westminster had established a framework for government and politics that would shape English society for centuries to come. The legacy of these documents continued to shape English politics and society as the country entered a new era of growth, prosperity, and development. In the centuries that followed, England would continue to evolve and develop, shaped by the principles and ideals that had been established during the 13th century. The Magna Carta, the Charter of the Forest, and the Statute of Westminster remained powerful symbols of the rights and privileges of the king's subjects, and they continued to inspire and guide English politics and society for generations to come. The signing of the Magna Carta stands as a pivotal moment in human history, a beacon of liberty, and a testament to the power of collective action against tyranny. This foundational document has inspired countless movements for freedom and democracy, shaping the course of human events for centuries. Thank you for joining me throughout this historical journey. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that, to understand the present, we must first understand the past.